Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm not Milan Nitsch, my dear DGAP colleague who had been instrumental in setting up this event series and was supposed to chair this morning. Unfortunately, Milan has taken sick, so I've stepped in. I'm Henning Hoff, executive editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's war against Ukraine continues. We are writing day 350. It continued with all the brutality we have come to expect. The battle has been particularly bloody around Bakhmut, where Wagner recruits are seemingly sent to their death wave after human wave for very small territorial gains, at least until now. According to the Institute of the Study of War, this morning, Russian offensive has started in Luhansk, and we will have to see whether that is sort of materializing or whether the Institute for the Study of War, which is a very, very good source normally, has got it wrong. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius visited Kyiv on Tuesday, something his predecessor never managed to. She went to Odessa instead, announcing future deliveries of around 100 Leopard 1 tanks and also some Leopard 2 tanks. On the political front, the big news of recent days was, of course, the EU-Ukrainian summit, the topic of our debate this morning, held in Kyiv on February the 2nd, with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President Charles Michel, and the commissioners all attending, sending strong messages of continued support for Ukraine. Earlier, the Ukrainians had suggested that accession talks could start within a year, and Ukraine could become an EU member by 2026. Von der Leyen did not publicly contradict this timeline, but behind the scenes, expectations were likely managed. Publicly, von der Leyen said, quote, "Europe is with you for as long as it takes until the day when the Ukrainian flag will be raised where it belongs, in Brussels, in front of the Parliament, at the heart of the European Union." And the special European Council, which is starting as we speak in Brussels today, is likely to conclude, quote, "Ukraine's future lies within the European Union." To discuss all this, we have once again three excellent speakers with us this morning. In order of appearance, we will be hearing first from Stefan Blockmans, Director of Research at the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, Brussels. He's also a Senior Fellow, International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. He will share his assessment of the EU-Ukraine summit and comment on how it fits into the wider enlargement processes. Very good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Henning.
Next, we'll be hearing from Iskra Kirova, who is a senior policy analyst at the Open Societies Foundations in Brussels. Iskra will also speak about the EU-Ukraine summit and the tension there is between expectations and reality. Very good morning to you, Iskra.
Good morning.
And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from my DGAP colleague, Dr. Stefan Meister, head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. Stefan will draw on a recent DGAP paper and frame EU's Eastern enlargement as part of the bigger challenge of rethinking policy towards the EU's Eastern neighborhood. Good morning, Stefan.
Good morning.
The paper is called Russia's War in Ukraine, Rethinking the EU's Eastern Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy. It is the product of the EAP think tank network, a project run by DGAP and supported by the European Commission's Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. The paper draws on last year's workshops and consultations organized within the network. And I should add that all our speakers today have contributed to this paper, and we will share the link in a moment. As it happens, we are also joined this morning by some members of the EAP think tank network, which includes around 90 organizations from the EU and EAP countries working on policy issues related to EU's Eastern neighborhood. We appreciate their inputs and feedbacks in the Q&A sessions. But first, each speaker has about 6 to 7 minutes for their introductory remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments after roughly 30 minutes. For the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your questions in person to the panel. You are also welcome to submit questions and comments via the chat function. Please note this event is recorded and that we will have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. And now, without any further ado, let's turn to Stephen.
Thank you, Henning, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces on the call. I wanted to make 3-4 points in relation, first of all, to the summit of last week, which was impressive, of course, for several reasons. First, it took place in an active war zone, which is a precedent. Second, it brought not just European Council President and European Commission President together in Kyiv, but also the High Representative Borrell and 14 commissioners. And that is bigger composition of the European Commission than ever before. You may remember that in November 2018 there was a Georgia European Commission high-level meeting presided over by Juncker at the time in Brussels, which saw a lower number of commissioners meet. And thirdly, it was a two-day event. The first day was, of course, devoted to the executive meetings with 15 sectoral commissioners, if you count Borrell with them, alongside their Ukrainian ministerial counterparts, which is, of course, a testimony to the vast range of common interests and integrative actions at play. The second day was then for the presidential level dialogue, and in a way, today the European Council is followed up by a third day, where Zelensky meets with heads of state and government in Brussels at indeed the European Council. The second point I wanted to make is that indeed the agendas and agreements that have been made have been hugely extensive, and I don't want to trawl through all of the accomplishments and all the envelopes that have been allocated for humanitarian aid, for including demining, for military support, for solidarity lanes and customs arrangements, the new European Bauhaus, which is opening horizon. But I mean, there's a whole gamut of issues, which is again testament to the vast range of common interests. And these and other initiatives are concrete actions, which in a way take place along the beginnings of the accession process. And this is my third point. This is exactly what a snag is, to my mind, because you have still a wide variety of scenarios going forward, especially if you take the most extreme political positions. On the one hand, espoused by the Prime Minister of Ukraine, speaking over-optimistically of accession of Ukraine in 2 years. Well, on the other extreme of the spectrum, you have President Macron spoken discouragingly about decades in the plural, if at all the EU-Ukraine summit was intended to manage expectations in this respect, then that's exactly what the main political goal, or second political goal of this summit was. And in fact, on the eve of the summit, emotions had already been dampened a little bit with the publication of the European Commission's analytical report on Ukraine's alignment with the EU acquis, which excludes the political component, with of course, justice and fundamental rights also excluded, and focuses on, well, essentially the second part of the questionnaire, which was filled in mid 2022, a 67-page document, which in a way is similar to the future agreement on Ukraine's EU accession, and which audits the compliance of Ukraine's legislation with EU law, according to well, the so-called negotiation chapters, which 32, 33 of them, rather than again the full gamut. But there are standards, of course, for all candidate states, and the Ukraine analytical report was published alongside those for Georgia and Moldova. And I'm not sure if you have seen the European Pravda digest of these three reports. They basically compared by attaching numerical rankings to the language which is employed in those reports to each of those domains, just to be able to see where Ukraine positioned itself in terms of readiness for accession, but also as compared to the other two Eastern Partnership countries that have now been taken up in the pre-accession process. And there, it's clear that Ukraine's readiness for accession is, in fact, not very high, despite the rhetoric that we've, of course, become accustomed to over the last couple of months. And when compared to the Balkan states, in their reports from 2015, which is the exercise that the European Pravda undertook, Ukraine's performance is also worse in that respect. And this, I think, makes it clear that it's crucial to establish, of course, credible sequence of the accession process, which at the moment, at least, is not very specified by the EU. You have the 7 preconditions which the European Commission listed for Ukraine in the avis, the opinion which it published in June, which will be subject to well, at least a review or a presentation this spring, and then a full assessment later this year. To decide on the further steps once all conditions specified in the Commission's opinion are fully met. But the situation in which we have now essentially a move along 15 sectorial lines of an accelerated / gradual integration is blurring the lines, it seems, with what is ultimately the bedrock of the accession, the pre-accession process itself, which is the fundamentals, encapsulated in the fundamentals first phrase. And all of this, I think, leads to the conclusion on which I'll end, which is that there's clearly a need to on the one hand, re-dynamize the enlargement process, which the current 2020 revised methodology is not yet doing, we don't know. And of course, at the same time, all applicant states are entitled and encouraged to adopt EU acquis and other policy norms as fast and as far as they're able to do, irrespective of whether clusters and chapters in question have been opened in the formal intergovernmental conference, which might be decided by the end of this year. In my mind, we're currently in a rather confusing blurring of the EU's own doctrine, in saying that on the one hand, the fundamentals have to come first as part of the formal accession procedure, partially also encapsulated in the 7 conditions set for Ukraine in the avis, but that candidates could at the same time go ahead and adopt the acquis across the board in any case, with cooperative initiatives being based, of course, on the association agreements, but not leading to a clear political statement as to where these countries really stand. And if the war drags on, if resilience is further eroded over the next couple of months, then I think we'll come in a very precarious situation for the trio in particular, Ukraine, but also Moldova and Georgia. And I think it is up to the European Council, of course, to keep them wedded to virtuous reforms. And to my mind, the European Council should then rather be highlighting that fulfillment of the conditions set in each of the candidate countries' Commission opinion would lead straight into an intergovernmental conference marking the opening of accession negotiations, thereby bringing both the effort of gradual integration and the political component fundamentals in the same policy framework of the IGC.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's move on to Iskra, please.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can see me. I think I've lost video on my side, but I hope you can see me. Ah, there it is. All right, well, thank you very much. I also want to start with a few words on the recent developments, the summit, the reports that have been released, also the EU-Moldova Association Council that was just held a couple of days ago. And then briefly look ahead and connect all of that to some of the messages that we have sent in the paper. So first on the summit, indeed, it was a historic occasion. Circumstances were historic, and the EU did come with a rich package and a raft of measures that were delivered. But on the core priority for Ukraine for the summit, EU integration, the results were less ambitious than what Ukraine and what some of the supportive member states were hoping for. The language in the summit declaration had been debated for weeks before the event until the very last days. And ultimately, there was no indication on when and under what conditions Ukraine might move to the next stage of opening accession negotiations, and that had been the main ask by Kyiv and by the supporters in the member states camp. And so the EU reserved the right to decide on these further steps once the current stage and all the conditions specified in the Commission's opinion on the membership candidacy are fulfilled. And so we talk about this in the paper, and actually we suggest that it would be a lot more helpful in order to re-energize this process, in order to re-energize enlargement, to actually explore much more these opportunities for setting near-term horizons and clear communications on next stages, expectations, and conditions. This is not as a way to prejudge the process in one way or another, or tie the Commission's hands in case Ukraine or the other candidates do not deliver on reforms, but really to clarify expectations. And so unfortunately, in terms of expectations on the next stage for Ukraine, on the opening of accession talks, the summit remained ambiguous, and that sort of was reserved to be decided at a later stage. On economic integration, the summit did put a high premium on that, and including by launching a roadmap for Ukraine's single market integration. So there's been much talk recently about economic benefits and how this really is the track to explore now. And indeed it is, because the association agreements and DCFTAs provide so many opportunities. But at the same time, I think it's good to have also a reality check on that and to stress that, yes, this is important. It's the first immediate track, but it's very complex on the legislative level in terms of legislative alignment, and it will take some time, especially in the case also of Ukraine in the conditions of war and its ability to align in all the sectors. So the good news from the summit were on possibly extending trade liberalization with Ukraine, which is currently provided as a temporary measure. That was a good signal, as well as extending the temporary lower or free roaming costs. But again, both of these are now temporary measures. And what we suggest in the paper actually is that on the basis of these already good steps, the EU should really begin to think of how to make some of these current emergency measures permanent, and particularly prioritizing the free movement of goods, which is a core EU market freedom, and move to permanent trade liberalization with Ukraine. Because actually the temporary lifting of quotas and tariffs is supporting Ukraine's war-ravaged economy, but it would really be all the more impactful if agreed on a permanent basis in order to help with full readaptation of business and farming strategies and so on. And likewise also for the roaming, the dropping of roaming tariffs and integrating Ukraine into the EU Roam like at home area. So this is, I think this seems to be the first milestone that could be achieved soon. But even there, even in, you know, this, what I think has been described as the low-hanging fruit, there's still quite some time, maybe at least a year to two before Ukraine can align. So we have to also be realistic of what we can expect in all these areas. On the positive side, there was also a mention of more assistance to be provided towards starting negotiations on the acceptance of industrial goods. This is an important agreement, ACA, so-called ACA agreement that Ukraine has been hoping for some time. But again, here, quite more time might be needed for alignment. And again, Ukraine's capacities are quite affected in the conditions of war. So this is all much less politically controversial, but important to think that it is not immediate and that a lot of assistance will be required for all these things to move forward. It was also good to see that the EU-Moldova Association Council, in a more limited way, went in many of the same directions. Just a couple of days ago, Moldova, like Ukraine, was associated to a number of EU funding programs in customs, in taxation, in health. There was also a promise to explore the reducing of roaming charges to support Moldova with joining the EU single payment, the European single payment area. And also on single market integration, there now might be a similar roadmap for Moldova as the one launched for Ukraine. And again, also for Moldova, and we discussed this in some detail in the paper too, there is the issue of trade liberalization. It is there in a more limited way for Moldova right now, just for a set of agricultural products. And the Association Council now discussed possibly exploring to extend that to broader liberalization of tariffs and quotas. So some good news on the economic side, I would say overall. Indeed, we also saw the analytical reports of the Commission on the alignment to the acquis that came out just shortly before the EU-Ukraine summit, and they were quite sobering. Of course, we have to underline that this is really the full screening of the legislation. It's to be expected that the countries will not be at the same level as countries that have been in the accession process for some time now. These are not on the political conditions, so not on the Commission's opinions and conditions laid out in there that were issued in the summer. These are really on the alignment to the full 35 chapters of the acquis. But yes, indeed, it was a sobering assessment for Ukraine. Basically, in most sectors, it was seen as having only some level of preparation, which is the second lowest mark. And it had a good level of preparation, which is the second to highest mark, only in 4 sectors: in customs, energy, external relations, foreign security, and defense policy. And actually, it's this quite high mark in these 4 sectors that offsets the relatively low performance in the rest of the on the rest of the acquis. For Moldova, Moldova is really the last among the trio countries in terms of alignment to the acquis, and as has been emphasized also, I believe, during the council, it's also related to Moldova's weak administrative capacity. It's not so much an issue of political will, it would seem, as much as weaker public administration. And this is an important factor. And so Moldova actually was seen to have only to be at an early stage of preparation in at least 12 sectors, including some of the fundamentals sectors in the fundamentals cluster. It's interesting that Georgia actually has a much more steady progress of alignment to DAP, and in most areas it has some to moderate preparation. And Georgia is technically advanced. It has a well-functioning public administration, actually, compared to Moldova, for instance. And so these are arguments that the Georgian government often emphasizes when making their case for EU integration. However, it really should be kept in mind that in areas such as judiciary, fundamental rights, the rule of law, de-oligarchization, high-level corruption, and these are all the part of the European Commission's conditions included in the opinion of last summer. Georgia is doing much worse than the other two, and there is a clear lack of political will to implement the necessary reforms and to upset the hold on power by the current leadership.
Thank you very much. I think I have to stop you here because we also need to get Stefan in, and with a sort of one eye on the clock. I'm afraid we have to move on a little. But you've already sort of opened our eyes to go beyond Ukraine. That there's sort of this is a process which is happening in a context. And Stefan, I think you want to add a little on this particular aspect of it. I mean, we've already heard very blurry situation in terms of processes. It's a wider picture, very mixed results, but there's more to think about. Stefan, please.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Henning. I think that's more what I just want very shortly draw here is the second part of the paper, and this is also about the changing geopolitical and security environment, which is also the reason why all this is happening now. Yeah, and I think we are living with the war, with the large-scale war in Ukraine in historical times, and that's changing the geopolitical and security balance in the entire neighborhood. We see that everything is now securitized, and we also see a weakened Russia in the post-Soviet space, but still with capabilities also to be disruptive. Yeah, and I think that has really big consequences for the EU. And I think the EU I think the colleagues already mentioned this, make big steps for the EU. We have candidate status now for two and a half countries, you can say. We have a monitoring mission, for instance, in Armenia now on the ground. I think that was not possible a year ago. But I think what the colleagues also already mentioned, there is a lot of now symbolism, a lot of showing also that there's a big will and there will be an integration of Ukraine, but it's all done in a modus of crisis management. And I think what we try also with this paper is to strategize. Yeah, I think the EU needs to change inside, and it needs also to become a bit different actor in its neighborhood. And I think that's a big challenge, because the question is there really a will also by the member states to make step forwards in reforming the EU itself, and then really moving forward and giving these incentives, which have been described also as successes to the countries we just discussed. And I think what we all understand is that this war of aggression against Ukraine ended any cooperative approach between Russia and the EU in the shared neighborhood. So it's all done also in the conflict with Russia. And what we see is there will be no speed up of the integration process, and we need parallel reforms of the EU, especially in the decision making, because I think there is also no ability at the moment or capacity anymore to take more members. Yeah. So and if it's taking again too long, like it took in the Western Balkans, we have another credibility crisis also of the EU. Every rapprochement of these countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia with the EU and NATO is seen negatively in Moscow. We have seen very strong statements by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, recently against Moldova, also using the same wording again like on Ukraine, that Moldova is now also anti-Russia project of the West. But I think we have to have also in mind how vulnerable these countries are still, and as particular also Moldova here. And I think what Lavrov did, he's playing also the internal weaknesses of Moldova, and I think we also should have in mind that Russia still has a lot of means to impact on the countries beyond military attacks. There are still gas and oil dependencies. There's disinformation, cyber. And there's weak governance, and as Iskra just described it on Georgia is performing very well in administrative reforms. It is really the forerunner. But if we see what's happening in the disinformation area, what's happening with independent media in the country, with rule of law, it's developing in the wrong direction. So I think despite all these offers from the EU, we see the vulnerabilities, and we see also contradictory developments in the country and in the countries. And I think the accession negotiations, they have to start next year. I think there is a momentum now. And then I think for Moldova, with presidential elections coming in 2024, and also for Ukraine, with the further depressive situation, I think then it's really the question when it will start. Will it take again so long like it was in the Western Balkans? But on the other hand, I think we have the corruption issue, we have the oligarch issue. We see that in Ukraine, presidential administration tries to show that they are fighting corruption, but I think that needs also a systematic reform and also building up capacities and institutions, functioning institutions, which then are also really credible in terms of rule of law and fighting corruption. So I think looking to the Eastern Partnership, what we have learned just recently also in Brussels and talking also to the member states, I think Eastern Partnership will stay. And it will exist parallel to the accession process. There is a rethinking of the Eastern Partnership policy at the moment. It will be more focused. It will be more bilateral. And there's a big discussion about adding a security component to the Eastern Partnership. And if we look to Ukraine, I think we need in parallel a reconstruction of the country, and it needs to be coordinated also with the EU integration. So I think there you see there are a lot of challenges. So there now needs to develop a security component. Also the whole question, what will happen with the post-Soviet conflict zones? Will the EU become more a peace actor? And on the other hand, I think the big project is winning the war for Ukraine, integrating Ukraine and reconstructing Ukraine. And that all will cost a lot of, but it all needs also political decisions and also political will. And if we look, and maybe I will end up with this, if we see here also how Russia is now weakened in the post-Soviet regions, and will not provide any more authoritarian security like in the past, it still has a lot of disruptive power to impact on the countries, also as I have described it already. We see that Russia Russia's interest also in the post-Soviet region are changing. It's more interested now in the north-south route to Iran and to the Middle East. It has an interest in better relations with Turkey, also with Central Asian countries, to circumvent Western sanctions, and that also changes the relations, for instance, with the countries in the South Caucasus, with Armenia, with Azerbaijan. Turkey is also for Russia, or has become for Russia a key country, and I think that will impact also on EU policies like connectivity, and also on the security component, and to strategize this, to understand that these processes are in making and further changing the geopolitical and security situation, and to adapt with a policy. I think it's a big challenge for the EU, which is mainly acting in bureaucratic processes, wants to keep also institutions, wants to keep these processes, but they are not feasible anymore to the challenges we have at the moment, and that needs really political decisions by the member states. And I don't think that we are there already, and that's why I think we need these kind of discussions, and we need also this kind of strategic ideas we have discussed here. So I just stop here to go also into the bigger discussion.
Thank you very much, Stefan. If you're interested in the latter aspect, Stefan also has written an interesting article for IP and IPQ on the very subject of this sort of this changing picture around the Black Sea region, and I'll post the link in a moment. But it's now time for your questions and comments. Raise your hand and get into the discussion. And if you need a little moment to collect your thoughts, maybe one quick question to Stephen. What would be your recommendation to get out of this sort of blurry situation you've described? Is it sort of, as Iskra sort of suggested, sort of more sort of expectation management and sort of clearer goals, or what would be your silver bullet to get less blurriness?
There is no silver bullet, but it's a confluence, of course, of arguments which have been presented this morning. The strategic one just by Stefan, the more economic one by Iskra. If the European Commission finds later this year that the conditions which it had set in its opinions from June of last year have indeed been met for one or more of the trio, then the European Council should, for all reasons mentioned before, take the decision to open accession negotiations, at least to start them, and to bring, procedurally speaking, all of the elements into one process. That is not the silver bullet, of course. What needs to be done, moreover, is to redynamize that process by switching from the unanimity voting for opening and closing individual chapters, indeed clusters, to qualified majority voting, retaining unanimity only for the big decisions that, in a way, is a decision the Council can take without treaty revision. And on top of that, as we have advocated for a year and a half now, is to graft onto the revised enlargement methodology a staged process whereby these pathways for sectoral gradual integration produce visible, tangible benefits, which translates ultimately in political support for reformist politicians. And that is perhaps, a way of both capturing the imagination, accelerating the process, and making sure that there is no regression on aspects of it.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We've got two hands up. So let's first go to, Mr. Wyszynski.
Yes. Yes, hello, my name is Gleb Wyszynski. I'm Executive Director at the Center for Economic Strategy in Kyiv. I have a comment, I could say, like I had some rather strange feeling after listening to panelists today, that it looks like our community, like I mean here, like expert community, think tankers, like is slightly behind what is going on the ground. Like I mean, both in Ukraine and in European capitals. Like as Ukrainian, I certainly have to read like all the news, like what happened yesterday, what happened overnight, and like also like some some messages were so close to what we heard before the Russian widespread aggression, widespread intervention into Ukraine. Like we need to still think about Eastern neighborhood, like while sincerely saying, like I now even don't follow at all what is going on with this neighborhood, because it looked rather irrelevant before the war, and now it looks even more irrelevant. Like the same goes to like all these things about like Ukraine not being ready, like it is not ready, and it is a long way forward, etc. I think that like certainly like those who took an analysis that was done by our colleagues at European Pravda are absolutely right that we need to go a very like we have a lot of work to do, but like the speed of with which this work should be done depends a lot on momentum. It doesn't mean that like the country with the potential like Ukraine, with the help of like our partners and colleagues in the European Union, could not walk this way faster. And I think that like in our community, we should be like on the edge, like being in the first ranks of like providing ideas about how to do it faster, how to do it in the most efficient way, and not just to like recall all potential issues that could be in the process, so that like we are looking reasonable and not too aggressive and not too like open-minded, I could say. So it was just like one maybe too emotional remark from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think it's too emotional, and thank you very much for your comment. I think our panelists are very happy to deal with that. But before we come back to the panel, let's also get Mr. Kakachia in, please.
Thank you. I actually would like to support our Ukrainian colleague, basically depicting the situation which he describes about the momentum. I agree fully that I understand that there might be some challenges in terms of how to address the problems related to these three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. But we have to also take into account this geopolitical aspect of this, because what we need at this moment is that the people in the Kremlin, they should get some sort of signal that Europeanization of this associated country, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, this is irreversible. And I think that should be the main message coming from European capitals, and which is, I understand they're still probably not clear, but I think this is what we want to hear probably, and then this will be quite a strong signal to Moscow. And I have one question basically regarding Georgia to the panelists. I don't know, maybe Stefan or somebody can reply to this, that as you know, according to last report, Georgia has a problem Georgia is not actually in line with EU foreign policy, foreign and security for foreign policy. And basically, as we see, this alignment is dropping almost like a yearly basis. So do you think that, because we also see the statement that EU asking from Serbia, Bosnia, and others to be aligned with EU foreign and security, foreign policy. But as you already mentioned, some panelists, I don't remember who, situation is very delicate in as to Moldova and Georgia. Do you think there might be some sort of call for these countries to be aligned and to impose, for instance, visa regime against Russians or some other things? Because this could have very important implications internally, politically in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before you go, could you just sort of state your affiliation?
Yes, I'm Corneli Kakachia. I'm director of Georgia Institute of Politics, local think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Iskra first?
Sure, thank you so much. There's so much to say to this, and I just really want to start first by saying that I'm sorry if somehow we came across as being not, ambitious enough, or trying to go back to any pre-2022 messaging on accession. Actually, this is why I opened up by saying that we wanted to hear a stronger message out of the summit in Kyiv, and it was disappointing, and I will put it now very directly. It was disappointing that that message wasn't delivered. And what we've said very clearly in the paper is actually that EU integration really should be seen as one of the instruments to reestablish peace and security on the European continent. It is that important, together with all other types of support for Ukraine right now. And this is why the way that the EU dynamizes and re-energizes the accession process will actually demonstrate what kind of vision it has for that region. We have we've wanted to be we wanted to really balance the need for real reforms. And I believe this is also the expectation of the Ukrainian and the Georgian people, to have real reforms, real progress with legislation, with alignment to EU standards and norms, with an investment by the EU side, a heavy investment in moving this process forward. And this is why one of the things I mentioned, we didn't have that much time, so we couldn't really elaborate, but one of the things I've mentioned is, for instance, setting these near-term horizons much more clearly and clarifying expectations, so that there's also less opportunity to politicize the process, or for interference by member states, or in other ways let it stagnate as it had for the Western Balkans. Likewise, we also talk a lot about the need for interim milestones, and this is what this European Commission update, for instance, in the spring, is going to be of sorts, but it could have been more ambitious. So there was a much more ambitious proposal initially by member states to have a proper interim assessment. Now it's an informal update, possibly even an oral update. So this again showed us how little will there is to invest in tweaking the process here and there in order to preserve this momentum. But actually everything that we argue about is these kinds of ways that momentum and dynamics can be kept up, so that both sides remain well anchored to the process of enlargement. So this is very much the message of the paper. And I think, and we also talk a lot about, of course, the options for gradual integration, so that we move away from the current state of having nothing until the candidates get everything. So there really could be a lot more gradation there. I want to say a few words on Georgia's alignment to EU CFSP, because indeed it is a big issue and Georgia's alignment has been decreasing. In fact, Georgia is now at the same level of alignment, more or less, as Armenia. So it is lower than the other two trio countries. And both Moldova and Georgia are in a difficult position, but Moldova has been making much more progress in aligning to EU CFSP and sanctions policy than Georgia has. I think with recent developments, and also with some of the statements that the Georgian Dream has been making, there is a lot of concern of which side actually Georgia is aligning to right now when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And there's also a serious concern with sanctions evasion, with the huge number, nearly 10,000, I think, Russian entities that have registered in Georgia with very little oversight over their activities, and with the huge potential for circumventing EU sanctions through Georgia to Russia, or from Russia to Georgia, exporting or importing sanctioned products. So my understanding is that indeed there will be a much stronger messaging now on the need for both countries, but especially Georgia, to align to CFSP if it is to progress with its integration ambition.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
Yeah, I think we maybe somehow failed I think this is exactly what we wanted to say. Yeah, and also in my short presentation, we wanted to say, or I wanted to say that that the changes in the neighborhood are so big, are so fundamental, that it needs a much more ambitious policy from the EU, and we are just seeing that it's not happening. and we are afraid of that. It's not ambitious enough. It's still too much also in these processes we had in the past, and it's so difficult also to change these processes. And I think it's also about the member states. I think there is a lack of leadership. There is a lack also of ambitions to change processes inside of the EU. And I think I'm really afraid of that we are losing the momentum. So I think this is the point. I think maybe also partly the colleagues wanted to make, and I think this is also what Russian leadership, what the Kremlin also expects, that we will on one point want to make a compromise, and they are playing also time, yeah, to go to this momentum, that our societies will not further support the sanctions, that there will be an interest in having an agreement, and I think that's not going to work, yeah. So, and I think this is also the argument we are doing in the paper. We are seeing these steps now by the EU, which are really big and huge for the EU, yeah. But at the same time, they are not enough, and they are not strategic enough. And Russia still has the escalation dominance also in this war. And we are not, and we are doing steps also too late and too little. I think that's really a problem, yeah. And I think that these were the points also we wanted to make. But I think we have to be realistic, and we have to discuss this here. We can also say, yeah, now there is a membership perspective. It's all great, and I think you saw also the summit and the messaging, yeah, and so on. But if you're then looking deeper into the processes, if you're talking to the institutions, if you're talking also with the member states, you see that we are not there, yeah. And I think that's for me the main issue, and how to push this, how to bring this further. I think that's one of the goals also with the paper, and to promote this, yeah. So, and there is a gap between the reality and the processes, and that needs to be filled. And I just want to make these points again strong. On Georgia, I agree with Iskra that this will be increasingly the messaging, but I'm just again here afraid of that the messaging will not be strong enough, and there will be no follow-ups. I think this is also what Georgian Dream knows. There will be again these lip services and messaging, but does it has really consequences? Will there be really higher costs? Will there be maybe cuts also? There's even sanctions discussed in Georgia itself. I don't think so. I think there will be more stronger messaging, but I think it needs also really consequences, and I don't see really these consequences. I think this is again what I'm afraid of, that this government also, like in Moscow, they learned, okay, they are talking tough, but they are not doing really the things which will increase the costs for us.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Stephen, do you also come in for 1 minute or so, and then we have 3 more questions?
I think in the interest of time, and it's better to collect those questions.
Thank you very much. So let's hear next from my DGAP colleague Anastasia Kukumian. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. So now Zelensky is attending the European Council, and I think that's also a strong sign of the fact that Ukraine just needs more support. And we can also see on the agenda of the Council that it's now, if there is Ukraine, but then also there are the internal issues of EU single market, migration, control of external borders. So in a way, it also shows the symbolism that Zelensky is there to ask for more support, and comparing to the first councils that were packed only on the issue of Ukraine, now it's again back to business, to usual business sort of. And I think my question would be more probably to Stephen, but maybe also to the others. How much do you think like this expectation that the EU will be reforming and there will be like the war is the driver for the change, that this expectation will actually become a reality? Or is it like, why are we rather getting back to usual business, and then Zelensky is also traveling to just ask for more support and to show the urgency of the war going on, because I feel we also now got used to the idea of the war, which is very problematic, and in a way discussing nitty-gritty details, while I mean Ukraine also needs more arms. So I think like how do you assess this reality that the EU will really change, and also the proposed either stage integration or the other models are going to take place? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nastya. Ambassador Baumgarten is next.
Yes, thank you, especially Stefan Meister, for putting some drops into the liquid. I think there is a disastrous management of expectations. What I hear from Ursula von der Leyen and all this is very emotional, and it is a very good support, moral support in a war situation, but it is far from reality. And I think we are running into the same trap that we had with Turkey, an expectation management which does as if it is everything is fine, and it is not. Nothing is really happening. Because why? Because the EU itself does not get into its own readiness. There is a condition that the EU has to be ready to accept new members, and it did nearly nothing during the last years to be ready for that. And we see that in the Western Balkans. Strategically, the Western Balkans have to be in the EU. Strategically, Ukraine has to be in the EU. But the EU is not ready, and it will get less ready. And a second point, there is an expectation, especially also in Ukraine, but also other aspirations countries, that the EU is a distributional institution which gives benefits. Nobody is discussing about the main issue of the EU, which is renouncing national sovereignty. We saw that also in Turkey. In Turkey, the population and the leaders of all parties, not just Erdogan, were never really willing to give up national sovereignty in favor of Brussels. And I see nothing of that even in parts of Poland and parts of Hungary. We see this, and this is a breaking point for the EU. And there is no sense in acceding to an EU which is falling apart. And it will fall apart if the mind of the people itself, not just some leaders, to give up national sovereignty in favor of Brussels is there.
Thank you very much. Then the last question comes, or comment comes from Milan, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Henning, for stepping in. In spite of my full nose, I'll try to say something. I was provoked by our Ukrainian colleague Hlib Wyszynski for this comment and question. I think our Ukrainian friends underestimate that this will not be, the next stage will not be like with the candidate status, that within 3 months, EU leaders agreed under the pressure of the war, because candidate status doesn't mean much. It's a political symbol. But the next step, the opening of accession talks, is a big thing, is a big turning point. Once you start accession talks, now there are already 4 countries in the Western Balkans in that stage, it's very difficult to get back. It's existential for the EU. You are entering a process which is not working. Ukraine has not learned much lessons from the Western Balkans why these things are not happening. And there is not much honesty and simplicity in this. I mean, you don't have a very open discussion about this in Brussels. The problem is on the level of member states, but nobody will tell you what the problem is. And I just give a hint and then over to the speakers. To keep the momentum for Ukraine and Moldova after the candidate status, to prepare for next stage, there was supposed to be some kind of an interim assessment of how they are ready on the conditions. What they will get in spring, and Andreas Umlaut hinted in the comment in the chat, will not be a full assessment or anything. It will be an update, an oral update. Why? Because among the member states, the Dutch especially insisted that it will not be committal and it will not be called even assessment. It will be just an update. And in response to the Dutch, then Poles came and said it will need to be at least publicable. So there was a lot of quarrels. Member states are divided. What to do next? They're not ready. They will not tell this to Zelensky today. And the big date will be October package, enlargement package, where the assessment will come to the table. And then Ukraine will have a challenge, because another message that quietly is being told to Ukraine is, don't drop Moldova. You are a package. Don't try to do it alone. And then we have a window between October until maybe December Council conclusions or the European Parliament elections, which will actually be a break and the end of this commission, to do something. So 2024 opening accession talks is the most optimistic scenario. But I think we have to be realistic, and we have to bring this Brussels discussion to the capitals, which we're trying to do now with more simplicity and more honesty. And question to Stevens and others, we are running out of time now, how to do it.
Yeah, that of course is a very simple question for the final round. We are run out of time, but I would like to go through the panel one more time. Each person has 1 minute maybe for very short comments, and then we have to conclude. Starting again with Stephen.
Thank you. Let me take a few points together. Nasya asking the question is answering it. There is a gradual return to business, of course. Perhaps as the winter effect, on the war dynamics is taking place, but that's not to say that it could not come back, especially when there are major offensives in the offing. But it's clear that there are other issues for geopolitical Europe to be dealt with as well, like US-China rivalry in the race for dominance on sensitive technology. So the EU has to move on all fronts. Is it enough to meet geopolitical ambitions? Probably not. And so that moment, and I hope we were clear about that in our interventions, needs to come this year. But it's also indeed a reality check on political perspectives within the European Union, that the EU itself needs to be reformed. After all, candidates would join a thick constitutional order where money and power are being shared and where trust is between them is absolutely key and has been eroded over time. And in that pre-accession process, where the trio in particular will hopefully advance more quickly thanks to modifications made to the methodology where the Western Balkans have been remained stagnant. Hopefully those advances can be made. Will that be enough, to break some of the institutional logjams that are currently claimed by the reluctant member states as a reason to keep candidates at hand? I don't think so. But the accession treaty itself, which is legally on a par with the constituent treaties of the EU, could of course bring institutional reform through the back door, and that is the idea of the staged accession model. Final point to Lucas Onderberg in his question in the chat. Candidates have to accept all the acquis, right? In that respect, so including working towards a higher commitments for the Eurozone and Schengen over time. But that doesn't mean that upon the moment of accession they will join it. Curbing veto powers in stage 3 of the staged accession model for a temporary derogation, of course, is enabling that grand bargain between reluctant member states that are wary of adding more veto players to the Council decision-making table, and at the same time pushing perhaps for institutional reform during that temporary period of 7 to 10 years.
Thank you very much. Iskra, 1 minute.
I'll say just a very brief few words on the issue of expectations management, because I think it is indeed so important. And what we see from both sides, actually, those who are outspoken on expectations are giving unrealistic expectations, and we have the two extremes. So on one hand, we have the Ukrainian Prime Minister Shmyhal saying Ukraine will join in 2 years. And of course, this is unhelpful, and it's actually only provoking the counter forces to accession on the other side to say, well, no, actually, Ukraine cannot be a member state for another decade. It's going to take at least 10 years or more. And I think either of this is unhelpful. Actually, what is needed now is to focus on the current policy and process at hand, really invest in helping the countries deliver on the reforms, built in these administrative, political, and financial elements. And by the way, we'll have also the midterm review of the MFF next year, and it's important to also think of the financial support so that they can deliver on the reforms and really focus on that and have clear, transparent communications, reduce to the minimum bilateral or other politicization of these discussions, and really move forward with that. Do not prejudge the process one way or the other. Focus on the reforms and real investment, real progress from the side of the candidates, but real commitment from the side of the EU too. That's the helpful formula in my mind.
Thank you very much. And Stefan, very final word.
So I think this war is an opening in the neighborhood. I think it's reshuffling the whole neighborhood. There will be new regional orders in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, in the Black Sea region, in Eastern Europe. And the question is what role the EU will play in shaping these new regional orders. There will be, as I said, a weakened Russia, but still be able to be a disruptive and spoiler power. It will stay an important actor, but other players like Turkey, like China, like Iran will playing an increasing role. And the question is, again, the question is what ambitions the member states have to shape this neighborhood. The EU is the process, is the instrument, yeah, but it needs leadership. Also, what Milan said, from the member states, and this is not there. This is neither with the Swedish presidency at the moment, nor it is with Germany, which has been in the past the key actor also on this neighborhood. And I think that's the idea with the paper. That's also for us the idea with the network and with the discussion here and with what we are doing in the capitals, yeah, that we need a systematic strategic discussion, and we need to come out of these purely bureaucratic processes, but doing really steps also in different sectors for the EU, which then also helps to shape this neighborhood. And I think the accession process is one important part of it. And if we lose again this momentum, we will lose the overall credibility, yeah, like we did in the Western Balkans. And I think that I don't know. I think it's yeah. I think everything is on the table, but it's also very, very difficult to shape this. And I think it's really, really with the member states and discussions with the member states. And I think there needs also pressure. There needs public pressure. There needs this political pressure. And in the end, Putin and the war only helps. Yeah. So I think without this war, without also this escalation, we would not move forward with several things. But we need to come out of this modus. Yeah. Then because Russia has still the escalation dominance, and I think that's the main challenge: how to break this circle. And I also have not really an answer how to do it.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So my summing up, maybe we needed Zeitenwende to coin a phrase also in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Apologies for running over. Thank you very much for attending this morning. Join me in thanking our panelists. Has been another very interesting discussion, and see you again next week. A very good morning.